Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the Halftime Talk feature interview. I'm delighted today to be joined by Mr. Jonathan Fulton, Associate Professor of Political Science at the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Zayed University in the UAE. Thanks so much for joining us, Jonathan.
Thanks for the invitation.
Lots to talk about in the political science sphere these days. Let's start with the elephant in the room, if you like, which is the conflict we have at the moment on Gaza in our region. I wanted to sort of ask you about your impression on, in terms of, obviously this is still playing out, this crisis and conflict, but what immediate impact do you think it's had to possibly, potentially disrupt the sort of recent, more peaceful track that we've been following in this region, if you like, between the Gulf and Israel, between and the other sort of, and the US obviously playing a part in that as well. Has that agenda sort of been knocked off its perch, in your opinion, for a while now?
Yeah, that's a really great way to start this. I think I host a podcast for the Atlantic Council called the China MENA Podcast, and we recorded an episode the first week of October with Mohammed Bahroun from Bahuth in Dubai. And we were just talking about de-escalation in the region and how, a lot of governments had pivoted and were focusing on economic solutions to regional problems. There's a lot of talk of how, just training and development and investment were driving a lot of the political calculations in the region, and how that gave us hope for, a more positive, peaceful future here. And so we recorded it the first week of October, and it went to post-production. We sat on it until it was ready. And of course, it came out, I think, on October 8th. So it already looked dated. I don't think it actually is irrelevant, though. I think that's still the appetite for most actors in the region, right? I think the fact that, despite the humanitarian, the just horrible situation in Gaza and Israel, what we're watching, I think the deeper political and economic trends are still there. I think a lot of governments in the region have been trying to walk a pretty thin line here, and I think they've mostly been successful of trying to make sure things don't escalate, so that they can return to this agenda when things maybe calm down a bit. So, I think if you look at Gulf countries, I think that they're laser focused on trying to do both to find a political solution to what's happening, while at the same time promoting this agenda, because I think everybody's come to realize after the last, whatever it's been since the Arab Spring, decade plus, geopolitical competition doesn't really have the answers for what the region needs. So I think there really is that sense that, people aren't willing to jump back into that competition.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's certainly going to take, though, a lot to resolve this latest crisis, when it, as you said, when it is over, or when it comes to some kind of strategic conclusion, which everybody's still questioning what is that. Let's talk a bit about China's role then within that. I mean, you said your podcast, China MENA podcast. China hasn't really spoken out much, has it, about what's been unfolding in the last month. Clearly, obviously, it has a big interest to see in what happens in terms of stability in the region, not least because it relies on the region's oil supply, which has not been disrupted and is likely not to be so. But what would you think China's take would be on this, and putting it in the context, of course, of its relationship with Gulf countries, with the US, etc.? Will it want to get involved? Is it involved behind the scenes?
There's a lot of competing pressures in China's approach to this. You saw in the beginning that China's first response was really to play politics with it. You saw a lot of, a lot of statements that put the blame on U.S. support of Israel, and that American policy in the region is what set this in motion. And Chinese support for the Palestinians. They didn't talk about Hamas at all. I don't think they've still mentioned the word Hamas in any of their official statements. So for a lot of folks watching it, it looked a little confusing. I think what the calculus in Beijing is that their relationship with a lot of the developing, or a lot of the developed world, with the EU, with the UK, with North America, with Japan, Korea, whatever, those have been their most important relationships over the past, from 78 until about 5 or 6 years ago, as China embarked on this reform era of economic development and reform. Those relationships have been severely strained over the past 5 or 6 years. And I think in Beijing, they realized they've kind of lost the West for the foreseeable future. So what they've been doing is they've been reaching out a lot more to the so-called global South. When they look at the Middle East, like you said, it's a major source of energy. Their SOEs do a lot of contracting here. There's a fair bit of investment. There's expatriate populations. There's a tremendous amount of trade. And when they look at the region, they think this is a place where they can, develop political goodwill. You've seen a lot of political outreach and state visits and things like this. Now, that said, with Israel, they know that they're never going to pry Israel out of the U.S. camp. They think if they support Palestine, they're going to get this block of Arab League countries that are going to support China. And I think it was kind of a ham-fisted approach, saying, like, we're going to speak for the Arabs and kind of solidify ourselves as leaders of the global South. And I say ham-fisted because I don't think there's any evidence that all of the Arab world sees us in the same way. There's a lot of diversity of opinions about this. So you saw at the beginning, China was using it, and I think it certainly turned off a lot of people in the region, especially the Israelis. There was talk of China acting as a mediator prior to this. And I think that was shot because, China clearly seemed as not an honest broker in the eyes of the Israelis. But then, like you said, their economic interests came into play, and you saw the threat of escalation would have a terrible effect on beyond the human impact, on things like energy markets and where China imports, between 40 and 50% of its crude oil from the Gulf, skyrocketing oil prices because of geopolitical problems certainly isn't in their interest. And you saw them quietly, working behind the scenes in the UN Security Council, and they sent their special envoy to the region. I think there was this realization that it was better to be a constructive actor. And then you also mentioned the U.S. factor that Xi Jinping and President Biden are set to meet for this APEC summit. I think also realizing that if they want to get that bilateral back on track, they need to cooperate on areas like this where both of their interests align very neatly. Despite the fact that you see strategic competition shaping, the bilateral relationship here in the Middle East, what the U.S. wants and what China wants line up remarkably neatly. They want energy going into global markets. They want, stability in the stable maritime security. And, I think really for China, because it's primarily an economic actor here, political stability is the most important factor.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's talk about a couple of touch on those points a bit more. Let's talk about the bilateral trade, situation between the US and China. Clearly hasn't been going well, a bit of a tit for tat battle over the last few years, more or less. What do you think Biden and Xi are going to, putting aside the current regional conflict here, if they talk about that, in terms of trade, in terms of the sort of ban on all the tech chips, etc. China's threat to Taiwan, which controls 90% of the world's microchips, etc. That's obviously a US concern. Do you see that resolving, softening, if you like? What interest would either party have to do that, and what will they be asking each one for?
Honestly, I don't see that changing anytime soon. The election cycle in the US drives a lot of this. The fact that they have a general election next November means that I think politically it's going to be very hard for, President Biden to appear to be softening towards China, even if, a lot of folks think that it would make sense for them to try to resolve some of their problems so they could start addressing these bigger global challenges. Unfortunately, that's one of the areas of bipartisan consensus in Washington, is that China's the biggest threat, and both Democrats and Republicans, for different reasons, have come to that conclusion. So it makes it very hard to see any kind of political solution to that. And that's not to say the ball's totally in America's court. China is equally facing a lot of political issues at home. Their political economy's been in a pretty rough shape for quite a while, and the Xi administration's approach has been to blame America, to say, the reason why we're facing all these problems is because the U.S. So I think on both sides, they've painted themselves into a bit of a corner. I do think that there's a recognition that any of the bigger global issues that we all face, whether it's climate change or whether it's geopolitical competition in Europe or in the Middle East, requires these powerful political actors to try to work together on these things. But I think just ideologically and politically, there's just such a tremendous chasm between the two that it makes it pretty hard.
Chinese economy, it was anyway on this transition sort of to change its model, from being, freemiumly manufacturing base, more of a service economy. Then COVID hits, probably kind of, threw it upside down a bit. But and now we have this new normal growth of 5%, 3%, whatever you might call it, a year, as opposed to the 8 or 10% we've been seeing. How challenged? You said it's challenged. How challenged is China's economy today? Is it as challenged as we think it is from the outside, if you like? And will it resolve this property sector debacle as time goes by in the next year or two?
I think the political side is really overriding a lot of what's been happening. Their economy has been very heavily politicized by the Communist Party over the past few years. You mentioned the new normal, and I think that language first started coming out around 2014 when they realized that they'd already plucked all the low-hanging fruit, and they're going to have to try to find a different way of doing things that you weren't going to be able to keep, with this domestic spending and infrastructure construction and all this stuff. It was done. How do you get people that have been saving massive amounts of money to start spending it? And that was pretty tough. And it's gotten a lot tougher because, the youth employment data, we haven't seen anything for quite a while. The last one we saw was around 20%, but I think it's much higher than that. I spoke with some people who live in China recently, and they were saying that students from pretty elite universities are finding a tremendous challenge finding jobs. And if that's the case, then you have to think that people that don't have those qualifications are finding it even harder. And of course, that creates tremendous political pressure for a party that, since the reform era started in '78, the whole raison d'etre has been, trust us on the economy, and your lives are going to improve. And now they've been trying, in this era of common prosperity, I guess is the phrase that the party uses to say we're going to try to rebalance things, that certain capitalist groups have gotten far too rich. You've seen certain sectors, especially like you say, real estate has been really hard to manage, but also on the tech side, right? We all remember when Jack Ma disappeared for quite a while.
Yeah.
You've seen how the tech companies have been coming under increasing scrutiny because they wield tremendous power and influence, which is a political threat. So I think that underlies a lot of what's been happening in the Chinese economy is just how do economic pressures, which have supported the party for decades, now threaten the party, and the party strikes back. And so that's why I think a lot of us have to be concerned because, we're used to looking at countries' economic engagement as being somewhat rational, right? If you're an investor, if you're a business person looking at a booming economy, you look at certain indicators, and now you have to kind of read the tea leaves and try to understand what are the political agendas of these actors, and it makes it really hard to figure out for a lot of folks.
Absolutely, from an investment point of view, it certainly doesn't bode well for sort of stable business decisions. Can I ask you a bit more about the Taiwan issue in terms of what the sentiment is from your perspective on, whether that threat to Taiwan, if you like, take it over, is really there? South China Sea policy. I mean, war games here and there being played with the Philippines now and then, etc. Do we see that in the next decade as a possible conflict?
Oh, the next decade, that's a big ask. I mean, there is a presidential election in Taiwan coming up, and I think that's going to, I think that might explain a lot of what we're seeing in the near term and short term is just that, folks are trying to influence how that plays out. I used to live in Taiwan, and, it's all anecdotal. This was way back when I was a kid. I was there in my early 20s. But what I saw at that point, and this was 98, 99, was that almost everybody I knew in Taiwan had family on the mainland, had a factory on the mainland, had business interests in the mainland, and there was just intense, deep economic interdependence. I think that still is driving a lot of the relations, right? The fact that their economies are so intertwined. I think for the folks in Taiwan, they've watched how China's reacted to Hong Kong over the past decade and thought that looks really, really, really uncomfortable. Nobody wants to experience the sharp end of that stick. So they're going to, stave off this China pressure as long as they possibly can. At the same time, trying to manage this very important bilateral relationship so that they, don't get caught up in things. I think when we see a lot of the commentary from outside talking about a war by 2026 or 27, I'm very skeptical about that. I think that, you know, despite a lot of the questionable political behavior out of Beijing, I think they do realize that you can't force, you know, Taiwan to fall in love with you, right? We're going to beat you until you submit, and then you're going to like being part of our country. Um, I think just the broader geopolitical trends that you would expect if there were to be an action against Taiwan, it's not easy to take an island, you know, especially one that's very well defended and heavily armed with a decent military, but also the fact that, you know, the Japanese prime minister, the Korean president have both said that Taiwanese security is a matter of national interest for them. You've got the India factor, you've got the Australians, you've got the Quad, you've got the US, you've got, and like you said, chips. The global political economy would be severely strained at a time when we can't take that, you know, if something were to happen to Taiwan. And I think if pressure started to ratchet up, I'd expect to see a very strong reaction.
Yeah, you'd think that the defenses of the world would certainly come to defend microchips more than anything else, possibly. Let's talk a bit about, Jonathan, China-Russia relations, China-Iran relations. One angle of that, of course, is that China takes Russian oil, it takes Iranian oil. It's not subject to abiding by the sanctions, for example, that have been, imposed on Russia and Iran when it comes to their energy, apart from anything else. Obviously, you know, trying to always maintain good relationships with those two countries, maybe for different reasons, but one is energy. But again, you know, China-Iran relations, even, you said they were said to be behind the scenes in terms of the peacemaking that we've seen in recent months from the Iran angle with the Gulf. I mean, does China, you know, it's sort of pretty neutral across the board, isn't it? It's just doing what it needs to do, China first policy. That's working very well for it, isn't it? In terms of what it decides it needs from each country, or does it have a priority in terms of, you know, is it more important that its relationship with Russia is stronger than with the US, or does it matter?
Well, from the energy side, I mean, I hesitate to use the word neutral because I think there are pretty clear preferences, but I think they are playing it pretty carefully. With Iran, I mean, what a lucky break for Beijing, right? They're getting tremendous volumes of Iranian oil at a huge discount. They're not using US dollars because of sanctions, so they're able to buy this stuff, you know, through other means, and they're able to refine it in their teapots, so none of it goes through SWIFT. And, you know, they're able to sell kind of low quality goods to Iran, you know, in this kind of bartering system. So, you know, it doesn't necessarily help the Iranians a whole lot. It kind of reinforces a lot of the resentments, I imagine, that Iran feels that the asymmetry of the relationship doesn't really benefit them a whole lot. At the same time, they don't really have any other, you know, great power to turn to other than China and Russia. So, you know, they're kind of stuck with them.
They're getting to sell that extra oil. They're getting to sell that extra oil that the US is turning a blind eye to as well,
right,
which helps because it's China.
So,
because it's going to China and nowhere else.
Yeah. So I mean, they're getting something out of it, but I don't think it's you know as beneficial as it's often portrayed. I think China, if you look at the broader picture in the Gulf, I mean, they do a lot more stuff on this side of the Gulf than they do with Iran, and I think that's why I don't like the word neutral, because, you know, there's between 3 and 400,000 Chinese in the Emirates alone. You know, there's less than 10,000 in Iran. There's a lot of Chinese companies here. There's a lot of SOEs in Jebel Ali and Jafsa. You know, they do a lot more on this side of the Gulf. I think they see it as a much more important economic set of actors than Iran. But I think with Iran and Russia, as you said, they do kind of present this axis of resilience or whatever against the US and the so-called liberal international order. They do cooperate on political stuff, but I think it's still a pretty shallow, you know, I think they don't really trust each other a whole lot. I think they just see each other as, hey, we none of us like the guy, none of us like the boss. Let's work together against the boss.
You mentioned the energy transition just in passing in one of your responses. I just wanted to know, not to get into the nitty gritty, but again, we have the COP28 coming up, being hosted here in the UAE later this month and into December. And, you know, obviously it's a countrywide meeting. From China's perspective, you know, it is investing heavily in renewables and its own economy and electric vehicles, etc. Huge transition happening there, but still very reliant on oil, very reliant on coal. It wouldn't agree to the phase out phrase at the two COPs ago, etc. So what do you expect from China, if you like, at this meeting? Any further commitment to anything, or again, just from an energy point of view, it'll have to continue, following its own policy, if you like, regardless of climate, asks, if you like.
I think the Xi-Biden meeting is going to tell us a lot about what we can expect from China here. I think if they're able to resolve some of their differences, they might find a way to work on this. China as an actor in the renewable front here, I think is really important. China's been, you mentioned EVs, and it's becoming a tremendous supplier of EVs around the region. They've really focused on the automobile industry. I remember talking to an Egyptian saying, we can buy a Chinese car for, a few $1,000s compared to a Toyota or a Mercedes or whatever. They're not as good, but they're good enough. And you've seen just this tremendous flooding, across the region, especially in countries that are a little less affluent. But also you see a tremendous appetite in China to export things like its, renewable technology. And I think that's a thing that a lot of countries in the region are interested in. There's a big push for nuclear that China's trying to step up and be a supplier in the commercial nuclear sector. So, and this is all aligned with their official policy. They released this document back in 2014 about how they want to engage with Arab countries, and renewable and nuclear were very important pillars in that. So I'd expect to see a lot more on those fronts.
Thank you so much, Jonathan Fulton, for joining us this morning on Halftime Talk. Great to have you.
Thanks so much.